I want to invite you, huge, big welcome here to Feel Good Naked, Dr. Nicole. Thank you for being here. Thank you for everything you do in the space that you hold.
Thank you, Sade, for all of the conversations that you facilitate. I am honored to be here amongst your community.
And for everyone who's going to be listening, we're going to be going into some quite deep topics. And so I just encourage everyone to kind of come with an open mind, breathe, relax, and just let go of any judgment or any shame around it, because I know this is a really big part of your message. Many people listening are maybe just starting this inner healing journey and they're stuck in this state of numbness in autopilot, as you've talked about a few times. Can you describe what that feels like? What are some of the signs? Because maybe people aren't even aware. I know I wasn't when I was in the middle of it.
Absolutely. And I think what you're asking and your lack of awareness really mirrors my own journey. On the personal side of things, I'm someone who, as long as I can remember, can really embody or I should say, relate to the experience of anxiety. I was an anxious child. I was an anxious adult. I threw myself into my achievements. Lo and behold, I become a successful psychologist. I have a practice. And what I started to feel really right alongside of many of the clients that I was working with at that time was super disempowered because we did not yet have this information that a lot of the times the way we're feeling, whether it's to speak to your question, numb, unmotivated, right? Exhausted, even. Maybe we feel a little wired and tired, like we have this energy, but we can't really kind of execute the things that we want to execute. And even a little less extreme, I want to include this. Maybe there's many of us that feel desirous of change, that are in coaching therapy rooms, just like much like myself, that are right motivated, if you will. And what I started to see, regardless of what category you fell into, and of course, there's many more outside of what I just mentioned, but what I would see with the clients who were very dedicated, consistently coming in week after week, is they would continue to report an inability to change. So, of course, I started to feel like, well, what role am I playing? Because I saw that same difficulty in my own life. I couldn't change. I was exhausted all of the time. I had ideas of what I wanted my life to look like, yet I couldn't actualize them or I couldn't make new choices. So, for me, diving into myself first and foremost, as I think many of our journeys begin. And what I understood was all of the symptoms that I just described, and many more, of course, were an expression of my nervous system, a nervous system that has been under resourced or simply unable to deal with stress because it never learned. And for some listeners, I mean, this was even new language. What do you mean my nervous system has to learn how to deal with stress and other emotional experiences? Though the reality of it is, yes. So many listeners might be experiencing some version of course, the spectrum that I described earlier of being frozen, being shut down, all of these, again, symptoms in our body that are really telling us that we don't have the ability to deal with stress. We don't actually have the ability to create the change that we want. Because what I really had to understand is that change in and of itself, even if logically right? We want to create new habits to create new outcomes to our nervous system, which for the large majority of us is simply overwhelmed and under resourced. Even a quote unquote positive change will create an overwhelming experience. And before we know it, we'll be back in all of those old habits, whether they're self sabotage or self neglectful habits or dysfunctional habits in our relationship, whatever it is that brought us into the treatment room, we're back and we're doing it again. And the issue is, and this is, I'm happy you already introduced this concept of shame. What then begins to happen is we feel even more shameful, even more broken, even more hopeless. So thank you for continuing, like I said, to really bring the lens of the body into these conversations, because I think for a lot of us, especially in my clinical psychology field, it's only in the more recent past that the body has even had a place in our conversation. So to simply answer your question, all of these symptoms are coming from our body that is under resourced, that is overwhelmed. We simply did not learn in childhood how to cope with stress or our emotions. So now we have all of these habits, again, feeling numb, feeling unmotivated, feeling hopeless, feeling helpless, feeling disempowered. And we begin to entertain this idea that it's because something is broken with us. Our body can change. We can rewire this nervous system, this subconscious mind of ours, this blind autopilot, everything I just described, and actually give ourselves a chance to show up more intentionally, more empowered, and more responsively to the world around us.
So, for everyone listening, Self Healers Circle is a really amazing space that you've opened. I've been a member, and I've heard a lot of this in there. And that's why I'm kind of nodding my head and being like, yeah, I feel this. I'm learning this. I feel like what's really interesting is how you're bringing in the somatic aspect of it, the body there, because it does feel like if you're really numb, right, and you don't have these big emotions, it's very easy to think, well, I don't need to heal. I don't have a problem. I don't have this anger. I don't have this same depression that other people do. So I'm okay because I'm not showing emotions. But it's that, as you said, it's you are in this state where your nervous system has just shut down and it's just said, we're not going to process this stuff, or at least we're not going to mentally do it. I mean, you're holding it in your body. But I feel like that might be a wake up call to people.
And I love what you're kind of getting at here, should I? Because I think what you're describing, I think some of us humans have this idea that life, the goal of healing, if you will, right, undoing our trauma means living a life where we are something that we could describe similar to numb, where nothing bothers us, where we're not experiencing any highs or lows or maybe any emotions at all. And again, the reality of it is that isn't possible. That isn't the goal. The goal for a lot of us is because I spent a lot of time, it was so interesting when I think of numbness. For me, it was almost like two sides of a coin, two very extreme sides, because there was many moments where I felt very disconnected, very numb. I have a lot of memories of even my longtime partner who I've been together now with for well over a decade would kind of wave her hands in my face when seemingly upsetting things were happening around me. And she'd be like, are you here? Like, are you not processing what's happening? So I would go from this kind of state of like seeming numbness, not really registering what's happening in my body, but then I would equally have moments where externally, maybe I was looking very blank, very shut down on my spaceship, as I call it now. Though internally, I was feeling completely overwhelmed, incapacitated, and shut down. So I just want to speak to that because I think sometimes when we say numbness, we do have moments where we could kind of describe it as an emotional flooding. Because as you beautifully are wisely describing, these emotions, even if we're numb to them, it doesn't mean we're not having them. We've gotten so savvy at disconnecting our attention from our bodies, at paying attention to the world around us, at caring for the world around us, for me, at achieving in the world around us, that it did seem like to some extent, and especially to others with whom I was in relationship, that there was this numbness. But I did definitely want to speak to the reality that that just as equally translated for me into many moments of feeling shut down, overwhelmed, even if it wasn't matching. And I think this goes into the circle and one of my big desires for helping us all create change in our relationships, because there's a lot of people like me who desperately need, I mean, there's not one human on this planet that doesn't need some sort of support and connection. I'm sure listeners, maybe you even referenced, right? We're interpersonal, we're social creatures. Simply, we are wired to need other people. Though the reality of it is, the way we learn how to even relate to ourselves first and then other people was in our earliest relationships. And like I mentioned earlier, very few of us have the ability to allow our emotions to be present in those relationships, which then translates into our inability to receive the support. And this is what carried a lot of shame for me. Seemed fine, right? I was a successful psychologist. Christ, I could get my PhD. I had a practice. I could choose where I lived. I was near accessible to a family that loved me and wanted a relationship with me. What was wrong? And in reality, what was wrong, again, was all of these dysfunctional habits that I learned that really just kept everyone at a distance, the world, my emotions included, that came from this state of nervous system shutdown because I was just simply too overwhelmed and my body simply didn't know how to be present with what was going on.
Because I can imagine how difficult that would be where you're in a field that you understand what is happening to yourself and you understand what can help, but you're still in it. I can imagine kind of the shame and judgment that might come up around that of, well, I have this PhD. I'm so successful. I'm helping all these people, but I'm in this position and why? Can you think back, like, what were some of the things that started to shift for you when you were able to kind of reconnect a little bit more with what was happening, at least physically?
Yeah, I think in addition to, right, those of us that are in the role of helping someone else or supporting them on their journey, there's, right, a lot of shame when we aren't, functioning or being able to use the exact same tools, as we know that we need to. And I think that that's, the reality for a lot of us is that there is a lot going on right behind the scenes. And so for me, my journey actually began when, speaking of nervous systems, my journey into shifting or understanding things differently happened when I actually started to faint seemingly out of nowhere. And I mention that because, right, losing a state of consciousness to me was very overwhelming, was very scary. I think I did what a lot of us do. I went online, put in my symptoms and was waiting, right, to be told that there was something categorically wrong with my health, with my brain. So again, I'm sharing that because I didn't have the awareness of why I was struggling the way that I was, or even the fact that I had any reason to be struggling. So what started to change once that I kind of dove down the rabbit hole of learning about the nervous system, of learning about the body, of learning about, right, kind of our autopilot and all of these ways that we've adapted to these environments around us, was I then began a journey of reconnecting with my body. And the reason why I'm intentionally saying that, especially when we're talking about a state of being numb or of being shut down, if I'm really simplifying what had happened, at some time in some place, like I said earlier, we became overwhelmed and we didn't have the resources to cope, right? So we distance ourselves from all of these overwhelming emotions, like we both acknowledge are still in our bodies. So maybe, right, logically, you hear a beautiful conversation like you and I are having. Everyone's nodding their head. Yes, this is me. I'm numb. So I need to reconnect, which means I need to pay more attention to my body. I need to shift my attention to feeling all of these overwhelming sensations so that I don't just react to them, so that I can make intentional, responsive choices. All great in theory. In practical reality, especially when we're coming from that numb, shut down place, what will happen is when we begin to refocus our attention from the thoughts in our mind, from this idea that we are similar to, right, being the professional in the room, we're self-analyzing, we're self-aware, we're understanding. In reality, what we're doing is simply spending a lot of time in our minds, right? Creating already a separation from the emotions in my body. So maybe, okay, I can see that, Nicole, right? I see how my mind is racing. I'm always thinking about what happened, what could happen, someone else. And now I'm going to make a different choice. Now I'm going to pull the focus of attention away from those thoughts in my mind. Because again, unrealistic expectation is that they will suddenly go away. Absolutely not. We've learned to pay attention to those things out of protection. Though what will then happen when I begin to now say, "Oh my gosh, there's a lot of tension in my jaw and in my, shoulders, and I maybe feel sick to my stomach." And of course, there's many other somatic or sensory-based things that might be happening to indicate all of these overwhelming emotions in our body. What will then happen though, typically, is I will feel, "Whoa, this is overwhelming. This is scary." Maybe this brings me back to that time in childhood where I was so overwhelmed and so scared, and I didn't know I was ever gonna get out of this feeling. I never wanna go back there again. So what happens all outside of my awareness, before I know it, I run away again. Right back to my mind, right back to my achievements, right back to caring about whatever it is, wherever I go away from my body. And I think for a long time, we used to emphasize in the field the power of the mind. What are affirmations, right? You think new thoughts, you feel new ways, you do new things. Yes, that's part of. We use affirmations every month in the circle, as you know, right? That's part of creating new actions, new beliefs, a new way of being. The other part of it, though, is the bottom up, right? Is learning in my body in those moments where I reshift my attention, how to actually be with those overwhelming sensations in my body. So it's about the patience, right? The reconnection, the journey of not just reconnecting with my body, learning how to create safety, how to simply be more stress or emotional resilient. That's what that word means. Can I cope with stressful, upsetting things and not just completely remain dysregulated for the rest of the day? Can I come back to peace and calm as quickly as possible? And until we can actually physiologically do that, we're not going to be able to create the new habits that we want. So this kind of brings the conversation full circle back to specifically the numbness, the shutdown, right? All of those kind of constellation of symptoms, because that's simply a marker of an overwhelmed nervous system. So we're going to need to create the tools to be with those overwhelming energies.
When you bring this up, it's kind of the missing piece because you were saying before you go back into all these habits that you've done before, even though you've got this best intention, this affirmation, this new routine. And it all just crumbles when there's this point of danger that you perceive or fear in some way, whatever it might be, and it brings you back. And I saw this again and again when I was a wellness coach, where people would have these intentions to change how they were doing things, but they weren't regulating emotionally. And so when something happens at work or something happens in their relationship, everything we had built on, everything we had created, it didn't matter for how long, it just started to crumble a little bit. So I appreciate that. And one of the things I want to highlight that you've said a couple times to ask you a bit more about, because when you said this in one of the, I don't remember if it was the Q&A or if it was another part, but it stuck with me so much, was how when you grew up with a caregiver who didn't support your nervous system, what kind of coping and what kind of response you have then. If you can talk a little bit about that, because when you said that, for me, it was like, wow, I had a single mom, she worked a lot, wasn't able to be there for me that way, and it just was the emoji moment.
Anyone out there who has parents, all of us, whether they're alive or not, or are a parent, I speak to these patterns and habits that are passed through generations, not as intentional to shame, but to really highlight the inabilities, the under-resourcedness, even sometimes the lack of information that impacted all of our ancestors or our past generations that got passed to us. Because what I am sharing, and from a child of the early '80s, when from my field, you would have heard from quote unquote parenting experts, or let me say this, like what you wouldn't have heard is a focus on the nervous system, is even a focus on feelings in infancy or childhood. I mean, there's a lot of us that have been the children of what we can simply call the cry it out method, right? This idea that children, right, feelings are really unnecessary. They could just need to be controlled and managed. So much so that we just put a child who's upset in a room and let them just cry it out and get over it. And I speak to this because we now know, given the reality of our nervous system and the functioning and the wiring, our nervous system isn't fully developed until we're actually well into our 20s. So simply speaking, a child, an adolescent, a teenager, again, well into our 20s, we can't regulate or cope on our own. I'm just thinking of all the generations who didn't even have this information, even well-intentioned parents. I'm thinking about parents and family structures like yourself, where for resources that have been lacking, safety in our environments, financial resources, stable housing, right? Relationships that aren't dysfunctional, right? And everything in between. The reality is what we were taught or modeled from the generations that came before us, right, wasn't a full comprehensive way to tend to our emotions because we didn't even know, right, that we had to. So again, bringing this into relationships, because my last book is specifically focused mainly on relationships. Those are the areas, to speak to what you mentioned earlier, where we might be with the coach, with the therapist, right, gaining traction in some areas of our life. And then it typically is, like you said, inevitable that something then happens and sends me back into those habits. And often what happens is within those relationships, because the way we learn to relate to our emotions, right, was created in those early dynamics, how present our caregiver was, how able they were to be with their own emotions to then help us be present, or for them then to be able to be present to our emotions, to then be able to help us, right, regulate. And when we didn't have that, that's when we get to see a whole litany of ways, behavioral adaptations, even identities that we've created in a relationship where we might become a person who, you know what? We don't actually have needs. We're the caretaker for everyone else, right? And we adapt and contort ourselves in all of these ways because, again, not only is it the way we learn to relate to our emotions that is a byproduct of those early relationships, but even the way we think of ourselves. And then we continue again to repeat these patterns a lot of times that aren't serving our actual body's needs if we want to continue the conversation around the nervous system. If we don't tend to our body, then chances are we're not going to be able to have the resources to deal with stress and upset when it happens, right? And then so the domino goes. Seeing these habits, understanding where they come from, not shaming ourselves that we're broken, but saying, oh my gosh, I've adapted in this very beautiful way to an unsafe and insecure early environment. I'm not broken. My body and mind did exactly what it had to do to keep myself safe. And now, second step, I can empower myself to create intentional new choices. And for me, the biggest shift in that was I was someone, as long as I can remember, like I shared earlier, was anxious. I could have never imagined a future where I could sit with you here now at 42 years old and say, no, I'm not an anxious person anymore. I experience anxiety and stress because it's a normal human emotion. I now, however, don't experience it as part of who I am. I experience it in more accurate, appropriate moments where, right, there's fear, there's threat. That's a marker, there's information in our emotions. But we can't understand or see that until, as I did, I began the journey of separating myself from my emotions, right? Understanding that for me, anxiety, this identity of who I was actually more of a symptom of a dysregulated nervous system, of a little child who adapted in a way into achievement and performance and pushing myself past my limits because of that lack of safety and security that I needed. Maybe this isn't a lifelong sentence. Maybe I'm not going to die an anxious person, right? Maybe I can truly create such a shift that I can just be me, Nicole. I still might react from my emotions. But what has changed is I can come back, right, to grounded, to peace, to calm, to separate myself, to say, oh gosh, I was angry then, and this is why, or I was sad then, and that drove that reaction. I no longer have to say, oh, well, that's just who I am.
I'm always awed by how much you share personally because it feels like you don't expect to have someone talk about it in such deep, authentic ways. And I wonder, is there a time where when you're thinking about, because this whole idea of it's just who I am, this is the person that I am, this is the kind of person I've done that. Every single person listening has done that. Do you remember what was kind of the shift where you were talking about that you thought, okay, I don't actually have to be this person, that I do have the potential to change. And I imagine it was a lot of smaller steps and things, but do you remember like what was that kind of aha, I can change this. I know this, but now I really know this in my body.
I appreciate you asking because if I'm being honest, as I always will be, I've been very fascinated. One of the reasons I think why I've become a psychologist, right? That's what I wanted to be when I grew up, was because I heard the idea of this power of the mind that I mentioned earlier. I used to read books about these people who created crazy achievement and, transformation and near miracle with their mind alone. We might actually read about someone creating change, and there might be a part of us that comes up and shames that person, right? That diminishes, that criticizes, maybe says that they're a liar and it's not actually happening, right? Coming from this protection of like, oh gosh, now I feel insecure. If you're telling me this is possible for them, I have to protect, right? This change, this desire to be in the familiar habits, the not desire not to change, right? That is driven by our nervous system is driving, right? That even shame of someone else. Or maybe you're like me. Oh, good for you, not for me. And it wouldn't until like you kind of went on. I made small daily choices. I began to empower myself in actions. And to be clear, what I wasn't doing from the beginning is completely feeling calm and anxiety free. The small habits that I was creating first weren't even really impacting my anxiety at all. And I think this is what's frustrating for a lot of us. What I began with were kind of the bigger picture, right? I looked at all the daily habits, understanding that my nervous system is a part of my physical body, right? And what I had seen in myself was an over prioritization of, probably not going to be surprised to hear this, all of the stuff I had to do, right? All this achievement, a deprioritization of my physical needs at all, right? Sleep, who needs it? Food, who needs it? If I have time in my schedule, I'll do both of those things, though everything else comes first. Why? Just to tie all this together, right? Because who I thought I was dependent on how I thought I performed, right? And that need to be connected, like I described us as social creatures, and back to this idea of identity a little bit, some of us begin to identify with all of these habits, right? Because that's how I fit in to these relationships upon which I was completely dependent for my physical survival. So this is why it's so hard for a lot of us to begin to create this separation between our habits, between our beliefs, between some of us and our identities, because we're then left with, right? Much like I was, oh, it's possible that I could not be anxious. Well, then who am I? Committing myself in daily action to begin to prioritize my physical body in small ways, going to bed a little earlier, which led me to then wake up a little earlier. I identified the morning hours as before work and obligations started as being the time where I wanted to send that message of prioritization to me, I matter. How my body feels in this day is going to impact how I show up, whether it's in my personal relationship, whether it's in a professional opportunity like this to connect and share and teach, right? All of that is going to be grounded in how my body feels. Because the more stressed our body becomes, like we shared earlier, right? The more likely I am to go back to that autopilot or that habitual way I deal with stress with all of these dysfunctional habits and patterns. So that then slowly over time, I can create the resources that my body needs to embody the change that I'm trying. And then somewhere down the line, I can't tell you the exact day, I started to be like, oh, wow, I have actual personal evidence. I am changing. I don't feel anxious 24 hours it almost creeps up on you. Wow, things are shifting for me a little bit. And that's the thing too with our autopilot. We become so familiar and habituated, we don't even notice, for instance, even if I like some of us might not even notice that we're holding so much tension in our jaw or in our shoulders until we release our jaw or roll our shoulders back down our back. And that's the experience of our life in general. We don't even notice a lot of these habits and patterns until we give ourselves the opportunity to feel differently.